want to introduce the CEPlaSt network. This is a network that was created in 2024 to combat plastic pollution, specifically in the Caribbean, but all over the world, looking most specifically at small island nations. We've been trying to bring different folks together who work in the space to talk about, brainstorm, and figure out ways to combat this issue. I'm going to ask that everyone, all the participants, put their questions into the chat. And if you have any remaining questions at the end, feel free to reach out to the CEPlaSt network over email, LinkedIn, and we will do our best to get back to you on those questions. Okay. So we are going to jump right in. I'm going to give a very brief background on the Global Plastic Treaty, as that is the topic of our conversation today. So currently, most countries in the Caribbean are involved in the global negotiation process undertaken by the International Negotiating Committee, aimed at developing an international legally binding instrument to prevent plastic pollution, herein called the Global Plastic Treaty. The Global Plastic Treaty is also sometimes referred to as the Zero Draft or the International Legally Binding Instrument. The negotiations arose from the historic resolution of the Fifth Environmental Assembly of the United UNEP in 2022, which proposed a life cycle and circular economy approach to the plastic problem. The UN anticipates that this circular economy approach can reduce up to 80% of ocean plastics, and is estimated by the Circular Economy Coalition. A circular economy of plastics could reduce greenhouse gases by up to 25%. So currently, as of today, there have been 5 sessions convened by the UN to discuss this legally binding instrument. The last session being at the end of 2024, December 2024, which was the 5th session. They are now calling that session 5.1. And the most recent, or the upcoming session, will be held in August of 2025. Panelists, if you have anything to add to that background, I welcome you to do so now.
Well, I guess what can be, I suppose what I can add is that one of when the trajectory was set in 2022 or 2022, I believe, yes, to negotiate the treaty by the end of 2024 by multilateral environmental or international agreement standards, it was very ambitious. The previously internationally legally binding instrument, which is that of the BBNJ agreement, took over 11 years. And I must say, despite the challenges the agreement has faced, and not reaching the set goal in December of 2024, the negotiations have really moved apace, or especially for internationally binding agreements. So I think the prevailing view is that come what may, there will be an agreement, whether it is the preferred approach will be a consensus agreement, but some states have indicated that if that is not possible, they will seek an alternative. But I think ultimately a consensus is the best for the effectiveness of, given the issues where that, as my colleagues will shed light on, we'll be discussing.
Great. Thank you so much, Alana. So we are going to dive right into some questions. So all these questions will be open to all of you, but let's discuss what happened at INC 5.1 last December and what some of the main outcomes of that session were.
So I take that one?
Sure, yeah.
It was quite interesting because we were at a point where we have a lot of consensus in most of the items, but there are a few items that we have no consensus at, and that's, where we need to focus for 5.2. And the one I'm most worried about most probably is the one that's focused on financing. How are we going to pay for all of this when we've seen before how things work when you have this other legally binding or structures that are paid by everyone, and how the money's properly used and everything. So, because everything else is just, what each economy can do. Some economies can move faster than others. Some legislations are easier than others in each country. So yeah, I'll say that there are only like 3 or 4 points that are mainly where we can say we're stuck at. But financing will most probably be the most difficult one, how we can do that. Because some countries will say, well, let's ban this, let's ban that, but this is not a ban, a treaty. This is a treaty to end pollution, and that's at least how I look at it. So yeah, if we focus on 5.2, that's 2 weeks, and from what I've heard, there's a lot of movement that's being discussed, and we've seen positions changed and everything. But hopefully, by the end of 5.2, we'll have something that will help us, not only plastics, but a lot of other products that end up the sea and in the sea, be properly disposed of. So if my colleagues want to add something, they're more than welcome.
I'll add here that one of the challenges that we are facing, and we as a global community, and this was reflected with 5.1 and probably will be reflected with 5.2, is related on the one hand. One challenge is related to the fact that not every country feels the need to comply with this in the same way. And so what are the enforcement mechanisms besides voluntary compliance, which has been shown not to work in a host of different areas? What are the different enforcement mechanisms that will hold various countries to complying with the plastic standards? The other issue is more with the calculation of a life cycle, with respect to plastics and the ways in which different industries and different firms will have to comply with those calculations, because a one size fits all approach or even an industry specific approach is not necessarily going to be fair to companies that have different sizes, are located in different countries, are facing different regulatory pressures in different countries. And so figuring out a method on the technical side that is both beneficial with respect to reducing plastics in the oceans, as well as fair for industries and firms, is going to be extremely difficult. And I think will also be an issue that occurs in 5.2.
Yeah, and I think picking up on both points, is two related issues are, one, that there are divergent interests and priorities in different states, and this leads back to Chinu's point. So for example, you may have states which have industries or currently have industries that are heavily reliant on um, plastics, or specifically the parent material of plastics, and that petroleum. uh this there's substantial hesitancy, I suppose would be putting it politely. And then on the other end, you have states which are heavily impacted not only by plastic pollution, but other impacts of plastic, or states who generally want to see this industry regulated because of its of various impacts. And this leads to not a issue that will and linked to industries as well as finance, is transparency and enforcement. Because one of the things that I can see happening if the mechanisms are not robust, are what occurred when, or what prompted for example, the Basel and the Bamako conventions, when you had a regime being implemented, but because some parts of the world are easier, or less regulated, or maybe moving at a different pace, what really became is a shift towards, or a dumping in those areas. And even today we're seeing this, um regardless of many of the mechanisms we have in place. So that's where finance comes in, and that is where the robustness of your enforcement mechanism. And as Chinu said, voluntary has its issues, but also imposing mandatory also has its issues, because we see that's not working. So that's many of the flies in the ointment as we go into 5.2.
Great. Thank you all so much. We've already started to touch a little bit on the economics of the Global Plastic Treaty, but I want to ask a pointed question about how you all think the economic implications of the Global Plastic Treaty might be, and how it might change things like trade between different countries.
Well, for me personally, I think this is a huge opportunity for everyone, because depending on the current regulation on your country, how you handle waste, it could be a business, and it could be a business for a lot of people. And starting at the most basic one, it's the waste pickers. For example, this could be a huge opportunity for the waste pickers to become more formal in the economy. And when I say this, it's because, for example, in the Dominican Republic, waste pickers are mainly located in open air dump sites, and with very bad employable conditions, and whatever they do, it's outside the economy. And if they become part of the economy, then it's more formal for them, and they can have a better health insurance and a lot of other things that are included if they are part of the formal economy. Second, everything that goes into those dump sites can be valued before it gets there. And, for example, the law in the Dominican Republic has the extended responsibility of the producer, and each producer must have a system to recover the product. Obviously, our law is new. Our law is from 2020, and we're still working with all the different how we're going to do that, because the norms have to be published by the Ministry of Natural Resources, but we have that on the law. And because of that, a lot of business can come out of waste, because everything is handled through a private-public trust. So funds are not, let's say, it's more difficult for everyone to misuse them. So yeah, I see a huge opportunity here for a lot of people. A lot of investment is being done in the Dominican Republic for a circular economy, and it's because of that, because of the law, not even because of the treaty. So yeah, we're a little ahead of the curve when it comes to that. And free to join, Chino and Alana.
I suppose one of the areas I could pick up on, and this goes back both to provisions and thinking about, so the region I am in comprises a large concentration, about 16 small island developing states. And one thing to be noted, that not all small island developing states, while they do have many of the same characteristics, they're not at the same level. But one of the challenges, or one of the things to be noted, is that at present, and this is why SIDS are small island developing states are even one of the things they're asking to be considered is the existing production of plastic, because the existing plastics are impacting their economies in many cases negatively. So when you think of most SIDS, their they're large ocean states, so it's marine plastic pollution, which does not occupy as large area in the treaty as it should, impacts them disproportionately. Fisheries and tourism. So even if you don't think, if you, when you think of macroplastics, I mean the images we see of like the 4-pack rings around turtles, and so that's the macroplastics. But there's also nanoplastics, which essentially get into the marine ecosystem. They biomagnify and bioaccumulate, and this now will raise issues of health concerns, and so on. There's also the issue of abandoned, lost fishing gear, so-called ghost nets, which is obviously an issue, especially for coastal states, especially those heavily reliant on fisheries. So the treaty can be both a way of addressing some of these issues, which are exacting economic toll, already on some states. And as Alvaro mentioned, one of the things I'll end with is the waste pickers, for example, are one of the, as you mentioned, a lot of they work outside the economy. A lot of their rights and so on are not respected or catered for in many of our jurisdictions. And one of the elements of the treaty is to look at what we call the just transition, where persons reliant on the economy will be considered, because it is a concern in many states that if a state regulates or passes legislation on to ban plastics, for instance, it will impact some persons in the economy. So waste pickers is one. Persons who work in the petrochemical industry, for example, are others.
So I'll jump in here and say that one way of thinking about cost is to think about immediate economic implications. And I think that those have been very clearly laid out. The other thing to think about, though, is the health implications, right? So, and I think Alana did a very good job in terms of talking about sort of the nanoplastics, right? So we have increasing evidence, at least if I trust the folks at over at the University of Colorado School of Medicine that researched this issue, we have increasing evidence that human consumption of plastics is being tied to a huge number of chronic inflammatory diseases that afflict right, heart disease, cancer, these sorts of things that we all deal with. And so, and those treatment for heart disease and cancer is a huge economic strain that reduces human capital, reduces right livelihood of people around the world. So I think that if the positive health implications of properly addressing this issue are taken into consideration, the economic benefits are gigantic.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Our next question is going to be, please list out some of the advantages and disadvantages of the Global Plastic Treaty for each of the sectors that you represent.
Well, for us, we see a lot of advantages coming out of this, because when you look, if you have clear rules for everyone, it's a baseline for how we do things in each of our countries. So a baseline for what will be the law required for how to handle waste, it's a huge opportunity. When we say about a disadvantage, or what I'll say it's more like a problem, is how each person, individual or country, will handle, or the expectations of each. For example, as I said before, we have a law that has the extended responsibility, but another country might say, well, I don't have that in my law, it's going to take me 20 years to do that, but the expectation of the consumer is to have it in a year. Then people will say, well, it's not good, or it's not great. But moving into a extended responsibility of the producer takes up time in that country because it is what it is of the investment, then, you know, it's how you balance everything. So that will expectation until what you get or what you get is it's basically probably the biggest disadvantage. But I only see a lot of good things coming out of this when it comes to everyone having their own strict regulation. Obviously, we believe in no prohibitions because the market will be the one handling how things move forward. But yeah, that's how we look at things.
For me, I think that for small and developing states right now, the status quo presents a lot of disadvantages, including disproportionate impacts of plastic pollution because uh, apart from being while their economies and consumer groups are small, they're often net importers of plastics, which and in many cases these countries do not have circular economy schemes. So once the plastic is imported, it becomes an issue, which leads to, as we've highlighted before, human rights issues, right to health, your it can impact on your livelihood because as Chinua has referenced, there are concrete studies and globally that there's a link between the cost of or increasing cost of healthcare and what that cost states as large island states. So most states are ocean states, so the impact on the marine environment of these plastics is tremendous. So the coming into force or this internationally legally binding instrument will be advantageous because I suppose the challenge of getting finance, but it's not just finance, but it's also linked to capacity building and technical transfer, which, as we know from the climate agreement, is a very sticky point. But that is an area in which can be advantageous for SIDS to help them have the capacity to have circular economy. And finally, the approach, as Alvaro mentioned, will now be a multilateral approach. So there will be more a way to tackle transboundary plastic pollution, which is currently not addressed, and is an issue because if as I mentioned before, if you're importing plastic and you don't have the capacity to address it, and it's becoming it's staying in your territory or entering into the sea, it becomes a transboundary issue. So I think overall, certainly for SIDS, and they've highlighted this, the advantages of the treaty far outweigh or are actually are a means of addressing a lot of the disadvantages of not having the treaty.
I think the treaty is quite beneficial, not just because the treaty has demonstrated or is demonstrating that a number of different countries can begin the process of figuring out policy solutions for this major global issue of plastics sort of suffocating the oceans and being in all sorts of creating all sorts of health challenges. But I think the treaty also forces, and I think a lot of the conversation here has been very useful, but one of the issues is that the giant economies, like, I'm an American, the like the United States, India, China, right? The very large economies that have been sort of hesitant or reticent to take the lead on this, they need to see the benefits of this type of regulatory action. And I think that the treaty is useful in terms of demonstrating to them about why this is beneficial. And I think, speaking to Alvaro's point about EPR or extended producer responsibility, in the United States, while the federal government is not looking at this, the individual states are. And what I can tell you is that a greater number of states look at EPR and honestly look to this treaty as a source of inspiration for tackling this issue than businesses in the United States, including Fortune 500 companies that want uniformity, right? Businesses want predictability. They want to know that they can make investments because there's some type of predictable regulatory environment. And so, as a greater number of individual US states embrace similar policies, then you will end up having, hopefully in the future, some kind of, even if it's not at the federal level, you'll have a more uniform, forward facing plastics regulatory framework. And so this treaty can play a role, I think, in creating the informal conditions that tell the United States, China, India, et cetera, why this is beneficial.
And so people understand a little more, Chino, of what you're saying. It's, for example, the Dominican Republic it's an island. We don't have oil. So what we'll do is we'll import the resin from any country that manufactures the resin, and we'll here produce a plastic bottle, and that plastic bottle will go to the market, and then it will end in a landfill or anything. But with an extended producer responsibility, whoever puts the product in the market, or if it's an imported product that came in packaged, is going to have to buy it back and sell it to whomever is going to produce it. So then, if here in the Dominican Republic, there's already a plan that's going to be doing that in the next couple of months. They're going to be producing resin out of that bottle, and if you include that a proportion of that resin must be used in a local product, that'll drive the price up, and it will increase. It will increase the profit or the margin when it comes to the waste picker and every middleman that's there. And it benefits the economy because I don't have to use US dollars or any other currency to buy that resin elsewhere because I already have it here. So the extended producer responsibility is a great tool that's in our current law, and it will help a lot when it comes to the economy and the benefit, a lot of benefit to everyone.
I want to ask a follow-up question on this discussion because I think it's super interesting. And Chino, you brought it up that in the United States, individual states are starting to look at the Global Plastic Treaty as inspiration for their own laws and what they want to do within their states. And I was wondering if you think, any of you think like the structure of this treaty needs to be maybe catered towards smaller areas, like even down to a city, or have individuals like recommendations for individuals, or if you do think that it's the structure in terms of like having full countries buy-in is what we really need. Like how do you, and you were discussing it about some of the larger economies, Chino, and how they're influencing this, but I would love if you could each speak on that a little bit more.
Well, okay. So, well, I think by definition, the instrument treaty, whatever we call it, will need to be entered in at the state level. However, a critical element, and that can relate to how communities and businesses and so can influence, was initially included. So the concept of education and awareness and how that feeds back was initially included in the zero draft. In the current chair's version, it's not as explicit, but the examples that both Chinu and Alvaro give are basically, as we call it, market forces. And once the argument is made, or once people see the benefit, so businesses, it's clear. I think what I'd like to see is and these were considered, I suppose, the minor issues, but it's critical to have this aspect of education and awareness, because often at the macro level, so at the state level, even businesses who are, who will be directly impacted, they understand the nuances of the potential impacts of the treaty. But often the man or woman on the street don't always see the nexus. And this is not only for the plastic treaty, this is climate change treaty, the biodiversity treaty, and so on. So a lot of uh, the average stakeholder needs to see what is this plastic treaty. It's like, what does it relate to me? And I give a quick example in the Caribbean where I'm from, as compared to where I am currently in the UK. So, you go to supermarkets and they give you reusable bags, and some supermarkets in the UK, for example, if you bring your bag, you can get discounts and so on. Uh, Contrast that in the Caribbean, we do have that system, but I think the level of consciousness as to why it's important isn't there, because often you will see some persons with the bags, but generally persons buy every time they go to the supermarket, they buy either a reusable bag or they buy a plastic bag. And basically and truly, basically, what's occurring every time you buy in a plastic bag is that it's defeating the purpose of the law on single-use plastics. And it's only, you just think, oh, it's 25 cents or so on, but the whole purpose of reusing the bag is to reduce the amount of plastic bags. So I'll stop there because I can go on and I'll let the others speak.
Alvaro, would you like to go first?
No, please, go ahead.
Or I was
So
just
I
gonna
think, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So I think from my perspective, I think one of the great challenges and one of the most important, I'm going to actually throw this on sort of Alvaro's area of expertise. It has to be business that's actually leading this. Because I think that if you look at what's happening in the world today, there's a huge level of distrust in sort of governmental elites, as well as some level of distrust in academic elites. I've seen it in the United States. You're seeing it in Western Europe. You're seeing it sort of, it's a global phenomenon to an extent. Business, though, I think still retains a little bit more legitimacy in the eyes of everyday people on the street. And part of it is that businesses are much more adept than sort of myself as an academic at telling people on the street that this is not going to take away their jobs, that this is not going to take away their livelihood, that this is actually going to create opportunity and not create suffering economically. And I think that if business takes the front seat and is able to tell people that this is something that's going to benefit them, not just in terms of health, but in terms of their pocketbooks, then you will have a lot of support for the Global Plastic Treaty and similar kinds of regulation.
Uh, yeah, I'm gonna pick up on that and what Alana was saying. And for example, Alana was talking about the reusable bags. And I'm gonna go to the beginning of our conversation and we're gonna talk about life cycle. And for that reusable bag to be more friendly to the environment, you need to use it X amount of times compared to Y amount of times when it comes to that single bag that you used. I believe it's like 150 times one and the other one's like 2-3 times. And that being said, if you say, well, perfect, you're gonna have to use it as a mandatory, people are gonna end up using it at least twice a year, twice a week, and then when you look at that, it's 100 times. So more or less, you have already paid for what the cost on the environment for that reusable bag is when it comes to using the other one. But you have to be careful when you do things like that. And I'm gonna go to the US and I believe it's California. You'll see that those bags are being dumped basically after a couple of uses because they get dirty, and you have more plastic and more waste going into the dump sites because it's a heavier bag and it has more energy and more raw materials going into that. And if you go to, I believe it's New Jersey, the local government had to put a cap on those bags because it became a profit center for the reseller. So they were making money out of that. So yeah, the private sector is the one who needs to push it, but we need to know the boundaries and how we're going to be able to use that. And obviously, you're going to have to know exactly what's better for how you're doing it. And for example, I'm going to do it in the Dominican Republic. That same bag you use from the supermarket, people use it again to throw the trash out. So that bag has two lives. The one that when you pick it up from the supermarket and then when you throw it away. So how are they going to throw away their trash? Because we're not into separating at the origin like other countries. So if we move towards separating the origin, great, but we're not there yet. So as I said, we need to look at the life cycle of the product, how it impacts the economy and everything else, and how it doesn't become a business uh, for everyone, and it just becomes something better for the environment.
Great, thank you all. Okay, so what do you think the most important take-home message to the audience should be from this webinar if you had to give them one sentence of this is what you want people to know?
Well, I'll say that this is a great opportunity for the world or each country to tackle how they handle waste. Because once you start, let's say we focus into plastics, but our law has many other materials included there, it will create a whole stream of not only businesses but also of regulatory changes that will help you recuperate all of or most of the waste. So everything can be reused or reduced or improve the economy of everyone. So this is a great opportunity that we shouldn't be wasting because there are a lot of resources for developing countries like mine being put into this. So we come out with nothing. Obviously, if what's proposed is not good for everyone, then it's better to do nothing. But if we have a good opportunity here, and we shouldn't throw that away.
I think the takeaway message, hello? Yes, the takeaway message is that I think that it's not if, but when we need a plastics treaty, because despite the challenges in the negotiation, the existing plastic pollution needs to be tackled. The optimal approach from the many examples that we've discussed here across our areas of expertise is that there needs to be a comprehensive life cycle approach. And I think that the overall takeaway is that not one size fits all for different states, and this is going to be where I suspect the rub is going to, not I suspect, this is where the rub is going to be in the ointment. We can look to many and you know, this is not an issue unique to the plastics treaty. We've seen it in trade negotiations. So we've just had the agreement on subsidies in fisheries. And this agreement had to consider the differences between different states. And it took a while, which we hope that it wouldn't be the same with the plastic treaty, but mechanisms can be worked out. And I mean, and there are many examples across the WTO agreement, for example. So different states, and so you have small island developing states, developing economies. Some economies have to, as Chinyu said, have to see the benefits. All of them don't have to, but many do. And it is really needed to address the trajectory for many environmental, human rights, and economic reasons. Thank you.
So I'll add 2 points to, I think, the wonderful advice that's already been given. The first point is that treaties are often, or treaty negotiations are often extended negotiations. So 5.1 did not get everything figured out, so there's a 5.2. There may be a 5.3. It's important not to view this as a failure, because the long drawn out negotiation is ultimately an attempt to get everyone on the same page, and there may be a breakthrough at 5.5 or some further point down the road. And so I think that people should not necessarily be discouraged because this hasn't already been ratified and adopted yet. The other piece of information, the other piece of advice coming from myself as a political scientist is that everyday people should take action, right? This is social, like political change and policy change does not necessarily happen in a top down way. It's a dyadic sort of system. And so what I mean by that is if you think about major, like clean air, at least in the US, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act that happened about 50 years ago, the tremendous growth of renewable energy that we've seen even in places like Texas, which is the home of the US fossil fuel industry, right? Texas has the largest wind industry of any state in the United States now. This happened because people on the ground, everyday people, were interested and wrote their lawmakers, took part in campaigns, ended up founding businesses to or working for businesses to increase renewable infrastructure. And 30 years later, there's a robust renewable industry in the United States, even in places where fossil fuels have their headquarters, fossil fuel interests. And so I think that this strategy is appropriate across the world. And if everyday people take action, then you will start to see more urgency to move on this regulatory area.
But being careful, because, you saw what happened in Spain. They moved into a lot of green energy and then whole 24 hours without electricity.
But I don't think that was because of the green energy, though.
It was something, they had to do something with the grid,
Yeah, and then there's
but a lot of it,
yeah.
but
There's also suspected cyber attacks, but that's a whole different discussion.
we're not gonna solve that here today.
No.
Well, thank you so much. I have one last question for everyone that I also would love for the audience to partake in this question. I was wondering if you could all speak on what you think the public wants to see within the Global Plastic Treaty. And again, I invite the audience to put what they would like to see in the Global Plastic Treaty into the chat as well, so it can be a bit of an open discussion.
Well, that depends on who you ask. If you ask and the country or the government, if you ask
The way speakers.
a waste picker, he'll want something. If you ask an environmentalist, he'll want something. If you ask a person that manufactures plastic, he'll want something. So yeah, it depends on who you ask. But what I said before, and I keep saying, is that this is a great opportunity to come together and end plastic pollution. That's it. How we do it, how we get there, that's another story. And how it doesn't affect that economy that's smaller or bigger, it should be there. But yeah, it depends on who you ask. The outcome will be not enough or just enough or more than enough.
Yeah, and I think that was the initial zero drafts tried to address as as broad a gamut, and while the current draft may not be, it's certainly not not everybody's cup of tea. I think what we also need to view these developments is also in concert with other developments in other areas of law related. So there's been a lot of development in, for example, in the area of climate law, and in terms of how, so a lot of this will feed into things like extended product responsibility. So currently we've had states essentially acts, and a lot of the content has also related to persons. What are the boundaries of responsibility in terms of a lot of these things? And we've had two advisory opinions. Tomorrow we will have the International Court of Justice give their opinion on it. So you've had the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea and Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights has also been asked to look at it. And I think a lot of these questions will also influence. So even though we might not get everything in one treaty, it is not in isolation. It's part of a network. And I truly think that it needs to consider both from the state level to the right down to the man or woman on the street who is impacted and who will be impacted. So it has to be bottom up, as well as top down, and of course, as I think Chinua said, businesses have to also be involved because they can be a double-edged sword. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. And they ask, does the current direction of the treaty take into consideration micro and nanoplastics from a production control standpoint and from an environmental output standpoint?
There's a chapter on microplastics, I think.
I think I suppose to be accurate, it looks at it from a more from a production standpoint. One of the criticisms of the December 2023 zero draft was that it did not look at it from an environmental or its impact on biodiversity. The argument of some states was that that was still there was no clear consensus, but I think clear consensus meaning that of the impacts of nano and microplastics on humans, for example. So it was mainly from a production standpoint. I think we're way beyond that now. As a matter of fact, I was reading a recent study published by the University of Utrecht this month, and essentially they have found nanoplastics across samples in different areas of the ocean, from coastal areas to further out and deep sea areas. So that means it's not only your macroplastics and so that are a problem, and we know from other chemicals like heavy metals, the and other the dangers and the destructive nature of bioaccumulation and biomagnification on humans. And this is especially so for states which rely heavily on fish and other macrofauna, because that's where it's gonna come to humans in its greatest form. Not only, but greatest form, yeah.
Yeah, well, the outcome of that is it's complicated, really, because the main let's say producer of microplastic and nanoplastic is synthetic clothing. Once you go wash it and everything, that is on in the water stream and everything. So it's gonna be complicated when it comes to that, but we'll see.
And I love the comment about synthetic clothing because people have gotten very used to waterproof everything, right? And so they don't want to go back to a world where you walk in the rain and then your cotton clothing is completely soaked. And I think part of it is we're trying now. I know that the National Renewable Energy Lab Plastics Group in the US has some work that's dealing with this. We're trying to create synthetic clothing that does not do what Alvaro is talking about, that also retains its waterproof properties, but that's very difficult to do in practice, and it's not as good as the current technology like Gore-Tex and things like that that is heavily polluting. And so part of it's going to require people to know what the trade-offs are and accept the trade-offs. You have a cleaner world, but you may not have a jacket that is perfectly waterproof.
And just adding to that, this is one of the reasons why in the zero draft, like the garment industry, because a lot of the garment industries are located in the quote unquote global south. So this will have a knock-on impact on, persons, as I mentioned, who work in industries associated with plastic. So, as Alvaro said, this is not gonna a simple task ahead of us. It's gonna be painful in some aspects, and it's gonna, as Chino said, require uh, our a refocusing of our consumer appetite also.
Great. We'll do one more question, and then if any audience members have additional questions, please send them to us over email or reach out to us through LinkedIn or via our website. But our last question will be, what is the reason why single-use plastic policies have not been super effective thus far?
Well, it depends on each economy. Some more developed countries are able to substitute or use something different. Also, it has to do with how the food chain or food supply works. And again, it depends on what are you going to substitute it with. And for example, here in the Dominican Republic, most of the substitutes are 30, 40%, 50%, 100% more expensive. So how are you going to be able to charge that on a poor country? Some people will not have a problem changing, but yeah, if the pyramid of your needs, it's basically you need food and you don't have clothing or you don't have something else, then how you're going to put that into motion? And as I was saying a while before, the market it's going to be the one that pushes and changes. When I started doing this, for example, PVC was one of the materials used in packaging. Now, very few companies still use that material. So eventually something different will come. Here locally, there's a lot of push into an American technology that biodegrades the single-use plastics, which will be like an insurance if it ends up at sea. Testing shows that any product will biodegrade or compost in less than 3 years. So the technology is there. That's new, and then the market is pushing it. No bioplastics, no microplastic, no nothing. It's a little more expensive, but yeah, as I'm saying, the market is going to be the one pushing it and see how things work.
I think what I can add is that legislation is not the only solution. I think overwhelmingly, I think many states think they will pass legislation and that will be the silver bullet. I certainly don't think it will be. It has to be accompanied by incentive, some amount of consumer awareness, in addition to many of the things that Alvaro has mentioned.
I actually am going to be optimistic in my response to the question. I think that policies are starting to be effective, and we can debate in terms of like whether the statistical studies show that the adoption of a single-use ban leads to reduced plastic consumption or reduced plastic production. But I think that these policies have only been around for a few years, and so a policy takes time to be accepted and absorbed and change practices. And there will be amendments to a policy over a multi-year span. And I think we just need to give these policies more time. And then see, like, this plastic issue did not develop overnight, right? This was an issue that took decades and decades and decades to become a problem. And it's going to take time to move past this problem. And I think part of it requires patience.
Well, as we are 5 minutes over the hour, I do want to wrap up and be cognizant of everyone's time, but I want to thank Chino and Lana and Alvaro. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us all about this topic. It's a topic that I know I find really interesting and I think is super timely, especially in the field that we're all in. So thank you guys so much for being here today and answering all these great questions. And I also want to thank all of the audience members who came today to engage with the network. So please, again, if you have any questions, please follow up with CEPlaSt Network at our email or follow us on LinkedIn or our website. We are trying to answer everyone's questions if you have more. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.